Hi, I'm Rajesh.
And I'm Richard,
This is Humanity.
being human in an age of artificial intelligence. This season, we're discussing how AI makes culture. And in today's episode, we're going to talk about AI and religion.
Richard, last week we spent quite a bit of time thinking about AI as a culture maker and how it might be to our future culture that the printing press was to the past. Anything that struck you that you want to repeat this week?
We talked about different aspects of culture that we think may be affected by AI. And to me, I think some of the more interesting pieces are the least expected. I'm thinking about religion. I tend not to think about religion and technology in the same sentence.
They almost seem to be going in opposite directions, right? One is very past oriented and the other is very future oriented.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it in those terms.
What makes religion interesting to you from the point of view of AI?
I think for me, part of what's interesting about it is the unintuitiveness of it. Because religion and technology generally seem like they're existing almost in different spheres, it's interesting to me to think about how might AI affect religions and affect people's experience of religion and experience of spirituality and the divine more generally, even if they don't consider themselves religious.
Yeah, I do want to add a qualifier because there are people who might think of technology, AI, the singularity as their religion. So we aren't talking about those interpretations of the word religion. We are talking about what would have been considered religion now for 1500, 2000 years.
Traditional religion as opposed to technologism. Is that a word?
Yeah, the church of technology is not the church that we're going to worship in.
To me, because religion feels remote from technology generally, but also maybe artificial intelligence specifically, that's an interesting thing for me to think about. Now, maybe the more that I think about it, the less I think, well, these are separate things. And I
Yeah.
think probably there's actually quite a lot of interaction between religion and technology generally. And I think that there could be some profound ways that artificial intelligence impacts religion.
And I'm thinking of something very practical that religious professionals do all the time, right? Let me just mention a couple. One is writing a sermon, and the second is giving a parishioner or a devotee personalized advice. These feel like bread and butter if you're a religious counselor.
And we might even add a third one of doing work with texts, like exegesis or even translation. Let's take the sermon writing. That's something that I have no doubt that there are religious professionals today that are beginning to dabble in using large language models, to help them write their sermons. I think that the sermon writing really is possibly not so distinct from other kinds of writing. We've seen that ChatGPT and its ilk can do quite a lot with respect to writing, that a lot of people are starting to think about ways in which putting the words on the paper might come first from a chatbot, and then the human plays more of an editing function. People are playing around with how to use the large language models in their writing workflows. And my suspicion that the religious aspects of writing will be not so different than really any other kind of writing, where the large language model may come over time to play an important first pass role in speech and text creation.
And especially because sermons have a rhythmically well-defined structure to them, right? People are used to hearing sermons of a certain kind, and AI might be good at picking up on those rhythms and getting you to be a better sermonizer.
Yeah, it's a genre. And the large language models are really pretty good at replicating genres. I wonder whether any of our listeners may have used large language models for writing this kind of speech or text. It strikes me as low hanging fruit right now in terms of how artificial intelligence could be used in a religious context.
So I just entered a famous line from the King James Bible, which says, "Whether therefore ye eat or drink or whatsoever ye do all to the glory of God." I entered that into ChatGPT, and it says, yes, that's a passage from the New Testament, specifically from 1 Corinthians 10:31. The Apostle Paul wrote this letter to the Corinthian church to address various issues they were facing. Then it goes on to say a few more things, and then it says the broader principle captured in this verse is that whatever Christians do, whether it's something as mundane as eating and drinking or any other action in life, it should be done in a way that brings glory to God. This is a call to live a life that reflects the value and character of God in every aspect. That feels like maybe something I would have picked up on if I just read that verse, but maybe not.
The interpretation, the interpretive aspects are
Mm,
something that,
yeah.
and I suspect you could probably ask it for another interpretation.
Yeah, let me do that. So I said, give me another interpretation of the same verse. And ChatGPT says, certainly. The beauty of scripture is that it can be multifaceted. So it says, here's another interpretation of 1 Corinthians 10:31. It says, this passage can be seen as a call to holistic worship. It suggests that every aspect of our lives, even the seemingly mundane tasks like eating and drinking, can be acts of worship when done with the right intent. And then it goes on to say, in this light, 1 Corinthians 10:31 is not just about avoiding wrongdoing, it's about actively seeking ways to turn every action, no matter how small, into an offering of love and gratitude to God. That twist in the second interpretation, right? It's that it's not just that you avoid doing bad things, but that there is a positive, active religious life to be led. And that's actually not a bad advice. I am not a Christian, and I'm probably quite far from being your stereotypical religious person. Nevertheless, it seems like a principle I can adopt.
Yeah, I suspect that you could take it even further, maybe asking for interpretations that are suitable for someone like you, whatever, whoever you are, your age or your religious
Yeah.
doctrines or lack of doctrines or skepticism about particular aspects of it, that it could be a way to explore a text further, particularly given the possession of the large language models access to many writings about that particular passage. So you can, in a sense, hear what have the various great minds said about that passage, even without having to know who those minds were.
So
It's yeah,
I asked it, can you interpret this verse in a way an agnostic would appreciate? And
mm,
it says, of course. And then it says, this verse can be understood as an encouragement to live life with purpose and intention. Even without a religious context, the idea of doing something to the glory of implies doing it to the best of one's ability with great care, passion, and mindfulness. For an agnostic, this could be seen as a call to live life to its fullest, to find meaning and purpose in every action, no matter how mundane. It's a reminder that each moment has the potential to be significant and impactful when approached with thoughtfulness and dedication, which is actually a lot like some of the mindfulness instructions that I've been exposed to going to a insight meditation practice session, for example.
right. Yeah, I suppose in a kind of platonic ideal situation for a religious adherent, they would have access to a teacher, to a priest, rabbi, imam,
Mm.
whatever, some kind of religious leader who has thought about these and has internalized a lot of the thinking about the religion. And they could ask for this kind of personalization for their particular situation and moment. But many people don't have access to that at any particular time or place.
And we certainly don't have access to great figures from past eras.
Yeah, we have access to their writings, which is also what the large language model has access to.
Hmm.
So we could ask,
I mean,
for example, what would I don't know, what would Thomas Aquinas say about this passage, or what might
mm,
name your some particular Christian religious.
let's say my favorite Christian religious figure, Saint Francis.
There we go.
Yeah,
That is
let me
right.
in fact ask. Let me ask. Let me ask. I'm asking ChatGPT, what would Saint Francis say about this passage? Okay, and it says, while we can't know for certain what St. Francis of Assisi would say about any particular Bible passage, given that he lived in the 12th and 13th centuries and left no explicit commentary on this specific verse, we can make an educated inference based on his life, teachings, and values. St. Francis of Assisi is best known for his deep love of nature, commitment to poverty, and his focus on living a simple life, closely aligned with the teachings of Jesus. If St. Francis were to reflect on 1 Corinthians 10:31, he might say, Number one, simplicity and intentionality. St. Francis might emphasize the importance of doing everything, even the most basic of tasks like eating and drinking, with intentionality and simplicity. For him, the smallest actions could be acts of worship if done with pure intent. Communion with creation. Given his profound connection with nature, he might interpret eating and drinking not just as acts of sustenance, but also as acts of communion with God's creation. Every meal can be a reminder of the interconnectedness of all living things and a moment to appreciate the beauty and the bounty of the earth. Humility. Francis might also focus on humility. Doing everything for the glory of God could be a reminder to act not for personal recognition or gain, but in humble service to a higher purpose or greater good. Brotherhood and universal kinship. Expanding the notion of doing everything for the glory of God, St. Francis, who referred to the sun as brother sun and the moon as sister moon, might suggest that in every action we should consider our universal kinship with all of creation, treating all beings and things with reverence. In essence, while St. Francis would likely align with the traditional Christian understanding of the verse, his unique approach to spirituality would also infuse it with themes of simplicity, humility, and a deep appreciation for the natural world and all its inhabitants. That actually isn't bad at all, in my view.
It's not bad. There's a lot of boilerplate in there about St.
Yeah,
Francis's sort of general views, but especially early on, it had some rather apt. It provided a different way of thinking about that verse, that passage.
yeah. And I think that if you are a lay practitioner who's removed from a practice community, this could be quite helpful.
Yeah, that's something that I've been thinking about a little bit in the past several days because I'm not actually Jewish myself, but my wife and children are, and we do a number of Jewish practice things to the extent that we practice a religion. It's Judaism, and we just celebrated the New Year, Rosh Hashanah, and so I was thinking about, certainly, well, what would, given that there's no rabbi in the small rural town where I live, what kinds of themes might they come up with for this year? And I found having a sort of a similar experience to what you just had there with the 1 Corinthians verse that it started out, having a conversation with, in this case, Bing Chat. What are some things to think about for the new year that it sort of starts out fairly boilerplate, but then if you ask for greater specificity in various ways, then it can lead toward more interesting kinds of outputs.
Hmm.
For
And especially if you are a somewhat sensitive reader, you could just toss out the boilerplate and just focus on the bits that feel richer. And that's totally fine.
You can also ask for it to speak in a different voice. One of the things I tried was requesting advice and speak as though you're a charismatic rabbi, or you could even name a specific one, like the way you requested interpretation through the light of St. Francis of Assisi, to give a different kind of voice for the out.
Yeah, yeah. We could do all of those things, and unfortunately, prevent myself from interjecting a somewhat cheesy possibility, which we can call it the Guru Turing test, which is imagine lay practitioner who asks a question and they have a religious leader that they respect and a religious leader who is alive and has recorded sermons or speeches or any of the kind of things that people consume when they're religious practitioners. If you can take an LLM to the recorded corpus, and then, of course, because their voice is available, you pass it through Whisper or one of those things that replicate their voice. And if the practitioner can't tell which one's which,
Mm.
then you've got an AI guru.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. So now we know what to work on what to work on marketing next.
I would imagine even video synthesis is going to get so good that it could be like you're watching two videos in exactly the same setting, some kind of religious establishment, and you're just hearing one of two speeches, and you have to tell me which one was synthesized by AI and which one was actually spoken by the person.
And we could start with the stripped down text only version of it. Also,
Yes,
it's
yes.
an easier one. I like this idea of the guru Turing test because the interest in some ways might be slightly different. Maybe we don't actually care as much whether we're able to imitate
Hmm.
successfully the guru, but rather do people find meaning in the output of the artificial guru?
I am going to go out on a limb and say that it'll be relatively easy to produce output that is seen as valuable, which is, of course, our theme of the day. That religion is, instead of it being very far away from AI, it might be a domain in which AI could make a huge impact right now.
Some of these core activities of the religious professional are things that AI today is capable of coming close to, perhaps.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
I think so. I think so. But it could also lead to entirely new forms of religious practice. I'm just going back to the printing press and how the Protestant Reformation was driven by access to print media.
Because that's a religious change that the Protestant Reformation that has been linked by a number of historians to the development of the printing press and the greater accessibility of the Bible, of the sacred texts of their religion.
Neither am I a Christian nor am I a scholar of Christianity, but it would be interesting to find out, did the printed Bible become more important in the newly established Protestant churches than they ever were in the Catholic Church?
Also, as someone who's neither a Christian nor a scholar of Christian history, I think the answer to that is surely, I don't think we really need to be either of those things to know that the answer is yes. The Bible plays, the reading of the Bible and the interpretation of the Bible, just as a general rule of thumb, plays a much larger role in most Protestant varieties of Christianity than in Catholicism. The reading of the text, is the translation of the text into the spoken language of the community that was associated with Protestantism, the prevalence of Bibles in the home. That's really something that was only possible as a result of the printing press and was something that has over time been encouraged by many, if not most, Protestant denominations.
Even the non print reception and sensory experience of hearing biblical verses requires print.
The hearing of, tell me more what you mean there.
So, for example, what I read as 1 Corinthians, I read it in the King James English version. I would not have had access to the English version before it was translated into English, which was going from, I think, a Latin text of some kind to a printed version of the English text, right? So I feel like print also influences the reception of religion, even in a purely oral auditory setting.
Because of the association between printing and a translation into the local language.
Exactly. That translation becomes an important activity precisely.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Yeah, that may be the case. Certainly, thinking about effects of printing on religious practice, I think we just never would have seen the mass adoption of the widespread prevalence of Bibles without the printing press. If every copy of the Bible is handwritten, there are going to be a lot fewer of them. We have that today in Judaism. The Torah, sort of official Torah scroll, is remains handwritten on vellum, on animal hides, and in a scroll form.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that, although you can have a printed, machine printed Torah, and people use that
Mm-hmm.
for study and for a variety of practical purposes, the Torah scroll, the traditional Torah scroll, remains a kind of a, what's the anthropological term, a totem, or it's an
Mm-hmm.
object of veneration, that you don't
Mm-hmm.
have an individual one of those yourself. That's something that the congregation owns one, or maybe a handful of them. It's like the single thing that you would grab, pull out of the burning building would be the Torah scroll. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's a different kind of relationship there, in large part because of the scarcity of them. It takes so many hours of
Yeah.
work to create one of those. You're just not going to have it on your own for sort of solitary study and reflection. It plays a communal function. This is our thing, our book that holds us together, and reading it publicly and so forth in a communal space rather than in a personal space like the home.
Yeah. The co-evolution of individual selfhood, of personal space, of access to a sacred book that could be at home rather than in a congregation. Each one feeds into the other and creates a whole new religious culture.
Mm.
And not just religious culture. In fact, it creates a whole new culture.
Do you think that within Hinduism there have been shifts in, say, the kinds of texts that are more important, or the ways that people interact with those texts as a result of printing?
Yeah, I think some texts have become canonical, like the Bhagavad Gita, and they were always important, but somehow they have become central in a way that they wouldn't have been before. And people will own a copy of the Bhagavad Gita in their house. So it's almost like we are looking for a Bible and this is it.
That
But
the sort of number and scope of the Hindu sacred texts are too great for them all to be possessed by a normal lay person.
there's a little bit of that, but also there is the need, partly driven by colonialism and having to defend Hinduism against Christianity in particular.
Hmm.
Once there's print culture, it is natural that some religious entrepreneurs they don't have to be religious leaders or gurus, but they could be publishers and others who say, we're going to pick these texts and we are going to try to spread them everywhere
Hmm.
because we think these are the most important texts.
It feels almost ironic that, in a way, the ability to spread texts could result in certain texts being even more privileged above others. Yeah, I don't know if this metaphor makes sense, but like a celebrity culture among texts, that certain ones can become widely known. There's not enough attentional bandwidth for all of the texts to be treasured by most people. So certain ones can gain primacy by being replicable.
And because there might be other attractive features too, but some of it could just be the winner take all effects that you see in a lot of networks, that that things that could be almost chance events could drive some text spreading further and wider.
So we could really see this as an example of an earlier major technological change resulting in some large cultural shifts that follow from the possibilities that
Yeah,
it allows.
it makes me think that religion and technology, instead of being like orthogonal or unrelated or even antagonistic, are actually like there is some sense in which every technological era might have its own almost privileged religious culture.
Surely the religious practice that came after writing differed from religions that existed in a purely oral cultural environment.
Yeah,
Having a sacred text, there's an authority that's even greater than that of the priest in the holy text.
precisely because it's a commodity that can be replicated and there's fidelity to the same text wherever you are.
Mm.
Intuitively, there's some affordances of the experience of divinity that are better by having the same text being the medium everywhere.
Certainly, there's the possibility for community on a larger scale, that the practice could be similar or even to some extent the same from one location to the next. Traditionally, one of the big reasons why Latin traditional in the Catholic Church continue to prefer the Latin Mass because it's something that is the same
Exactly the
everywhere.
same.
Yeah.
Going back to a topic that we have discussed before, you could have this uniformity imposed by having one language and one priesthood that's trained in that language, and they are the ones who uphold that similarity, if not identity, of experiences. But with the printing press, you can have a great deal of convergence while having very distributed and decentralized forms of governance.
Right. Because everyone has access to the same text, and
Wherever you are.
the text is what binds people rather than the priesthood. Thinking about artificial intelligence, it's not clear to me what kind of effect it might have or will have in time on, as you say, the affordances of religious experience. We arguably saw, with as a result of the printing press, a kind of personalization of religious experience. You certainly see this with the difference between Catholic prayer and Protestant prayer, that it's much more common for Protestants to use the first person, the I voice, in addressing God, and to say
Mm.
prayers that they come up with in the moment. Right? They're not ritualistic prayers. They're something that I'm talking to God. I'm having a conversation with God. It's very individual. In contrast to the sort of prayer that's more typical of Catholicism, and I add also Judaism, where you really don't talk to God. It's you would use a prayer that's something that someone else, or probably many someone else's, came up with over long periods of time, and that it's much more of a formulaic and communal approach. For artificial
And
intelligence, the possibility of accessing religious guidance not through a priest or a teacher, but through the device, in some ways, maybe that's an extension of that, right? Because you're asking the question, the device giving responses.
yeah, unlike, say, the danger in having the actual text be the sacred entity so that fundamentalism becomes a genuine possibility, it could be that here is this device that's pretty context sensitive.
Mm,
And so there's more acceptance of diversity of both belief and of experience and of faith, and yet there could be a sense of it's still the same thing.
uh-huh. Uh-huh. In some ways, it's a little bit like with the internet, how we've had a kind of fracturing of community into different echo chambers. I think there's the same possibility for that here with the individual's access to, or not access to artificial intelligence, but their separate conversations with the chatbot.
We know that the algorithms that drive that kind of niche production in the internet are not that different from the algorithms that inform LLMs, like in the bigger scheme of things. So it could be that we will see fracturing of religious communities because people will gravitate towards others who occupy a narrower space of religious experience.
We don't have the same priests to ask the questions of. We're effectively
Yeah,
getting different kinds of guidance.
that has happened with human priests because of the internet, because niche communities are possible around charismatic leaders, which would have been harder except for very big names in the past. If I am a religious leader who can survive with 1,000 devotees or disciples somewhere in the world, then I can form my sub religion. And maybe AI will make that, instead of it being 1,000 or 10,000, maybe it'll be 100. That you could just have a designer religion for 100 people.
At some point, the new interpretations and so forth become their own religion. We talked earlier about
So,
ways that the some of the functions of the large language models now replace or have the potential to replace aspects of the religious professional. But I'm wondering if you
mhm.
think there are other functions that are played by a religious professional are less likely to be shared, have a burden that's shared with the artificial intelligence.
In at least the Indo-Tibetan, both Hindu, Buddhist, and maybe, and it's also, I think, some of the Muslim and Sikh traditions, the guru figure's charisma is crucial. Like Zen will say that it is a special transmission outside the scriptures. I'm loosely translating what it says about itself. And that's because there's some direct guru to disciple transmission. That's the heart of the religious magic. And maybe that will be the thing that'll be hardest to replicate, because there being a human being on the other side seems to be essential to that sense of transmission.
And maybe something like charisma might be a shorthand for that. But that's not
Yeah.
something, it's not clear how artificial intelligence will replicate that function.
And if you have to invest in being a scholar and worry that AI would replace you, and invest in being a charismatic religious figure, it might be that the scales are being tipped towards the charismatic figure.
That the scholarliness of religion might become more democratized or more accessible in a sense. That used to be something that was almost the
Mm-hmm.
opposite, right? That knowing how to read and
Yeah.
having access to texts and so forth was something accessible only to the few, but that might become more widely accessible in contrast to charisma.
Yeah, that's the scarce commodity.
Something else that I'm thinking about is a community. For many religions, that's a major function of religion is the community, the connection with other people, the formation, the sustaining of community. And I don't really see how artificial intelligence assists with that, or how it could really do much in the way of community building.
Yeah, I don't either. But yeah, I don't even want to speculate, because I feel like it seems so almost the opposite of what AI would do.
Which in some ways, just as possibly charisma might become more of a valuable commodity in an age of AI, maybe community would as well, precisely because it's not something that's available through the artificial intelligence.
Yeah, certainly some things, and this is true not just of religion, some things that feel almost quintessentially human are the things that are going to be the most precious.
And what I think is interesting about that is that what feels quintessentially human is up for grabs. It's something that can change. And the
Mm,
introduction of artificial intelligence shifts that somewhat.
mm,
The Some of the things like being able to translate between languages until pretty recent, that was quintessentially human. And we really couldn't do very
yeah,
good machine translations, and now they're really pretty good. I mean, they're much better than they were even certainly than they were 10 years ago. Yeah, and so that sort of becomes a little bit less quintessentially human now than it used to be. And I think some of these things, like being able to write a sermon or interpret sacred texts, being able to offer guidance, that's perhaps not as much where the humanities is felt.
I'm absolutely with you on that. Is that, in fact, the story of this podcast might as well be the shifting understanding of what it is to be human, given that we are going to share work and play with these machines.
It's interesting that What a machine can do, we find somewhat less valuable because it's more replicable. It's something that we don't need a person to do it. What is it that we need
And
a person to do for
yeah,
religion or spiritual practice? That might be a key question going forward.
and it could be a key question for pretty much any of the culture making activities that we are going to be focusing on. So, Richard, this discussion on religion really opened up themes about AI and culture that I feel we'll be exploring for a while. And in fact, I have to say, just typing that line into ChatGPT and seeing what it says had a slightly magical quality for me when I was doing it.
We're really not used to that kind of thinking, those kinds of ideas coming out of a machine. I'm not.
Hmm.
It feels like something that's so
Yeah, neither am
human, and
I.
yet now we can get it from a machine. Surely that's going to have some big influences on how we think about what's human, but also how do we look for meaning and where do we look for it and what is the meaning that we find when we go looking for it.
So let me end with not a hypothesis, but like maybe two polar hypotheses. Right? One pole, which seems obvious, is we will search for what is quintessentially human in the things that the technology of the day, in this case AI, cannot do. Right? It's like maximally removed from it. But it could also be the exact opposite. It's that maybe what will be quintessentially human is the remarkable achievements that will come from humans and AI working together. It's both climbing Mount Everest without oxygen tanks, so that's the human without machine,
Mm-hmm.
and it is
Going to space.
being able to
Look how high you
going
can
to
go if you're in
space.
a spaceship.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. There are two forms of ascent, and they both have the same kind of spiritual quality to them.
Well, we still have running races, even though we can also jump in a car or an airplane and get someplace much quicker.
Let's hope that we all have some races that we can run for fun, if not for profit. Great talking to you, Richard, as usual. We'll be back next week.
Great to talk to you, Rajesh.
Bye then.
Bye.
You've been listening to Humanity, being human in an age of artificial intelligence. We'll see you next week as we continue discussing how AI makes culture.